Hello, this is Dana Hogue, and welcome to Week 5. Now, last week, or in the past, we've talked about the plan part of the policy recipe. That's that part that lies in that top circle. This is the structural part of the process. That is, we make structure around what we want to happen. It's somewhat predictable since we're picking the tools we're going to use, like taxes, and we're using science to determine the impacts. But politics can be defined by some people as the art of the possible, the art of compromise, and the art of determining who gets to get what. These activities occur outside the circle. In other words, you can go to all that work, and then outside the circle, the art matters more than the science. Therefore, we now move to a process outside the circle, which we're going to call the process. And this is also a plan in a sense, but it's a plan that focuses on the policy process, not the policy tools. So it's not the content of the tools we're worried about or the policy, it's the process of how you get that accepted. So we have to study that. Essentially, we're trying to just get through that darn minefield of blocks that could derail our technology or the policy that we developed in the first circle. Now, the policy formation process has an important influence on how policy is developed and implemented. In some ways, it may be just as important as the policy itself. Therefore, it's essential to have an understanding of the process and the central actors in that process. Think of it as the politics of how a bill or a policy is passed. So again, we need to track a policy through this minefield and come out the other side with a policy that's not distorted beyond what we desire through compromise and deals. So as we go through that minefield, it may not be just that we get stopped, is we might really just get our bill or our policy becomes so distorted we can't even recognize it. Therefore, we need to understand the process of seeing a good proposal through to success. That is, we have to choose a strategy to get through that darn minefield. So let's start with a discussion about the three kinds of mines first. I call them mines because you have to carry your policy through a virtual minefield where stepping on any of these landmines could stop you cold. So imagine you've worked on your policy and you're really happy about it and you've conquered every battle, done every detail, and you walk out of the top circle with this great plan, and you step on a landmine of somebody that wants to stop you, even though your plan is good, because they have some selfish motive. You have to understand that, and you have to make a plan, or else you're not going to get through. Okay, the first mine that we're going to talk about is that a policy has to be politically, socially, and economically feasible. Luther Tweeten put it this way. He said that a good adage in economics is good politics is invalid. Okay, that adage is invalid because public policy is a compromise of the economically desirable, the socially acceptable, and the politically feasible. We're just going to call that economic, social, and political feasibility to make it simpler. Goals and values are important, but it is well to bear in mind that pressure groups and events, not ideology, control public policy to a great degree. Now that's important. So what he's saying is maybe as a society we value one thing or another, but some event like one of these school shootings can really have an impact on what we do. So, for example, it may be politically and economically possible to get a bill passed, but not socially acceptable. Or it might be the opposite. It might be socially feasible, but not politically feasible. Now, I guess before we go on to authorization, let me make one more example. Um, there are lots of things that are contemporary, like prostitution, legalizing prostitution, or gun control, or all these touchy issues that can be economical or political or social, but not all three. And then those bills often don't get passed. So, for example, legalizing prostitution. It's probably economically possible. It's probably not an issue there. Socially, it's probably way more acceptable than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago. However, even if the majority of society would be willing to allow legalized prostitution, there may be a small minority that's vocal enough that they can keep that from happening. We saw that recently in states like Colorado where marijuana passed. Marijuana has for a long time not been socially acceptable and hasn't been politically feasible to allow marijuana to be smoked legally, but it is socially acceptable enough now that the citizens of the state were able to pass a bill. So sometimes things are not, they're socially acceptable but not politically possible to get passed. Sometimes it's the other way around. I could politically pass it, but it wouldn't be socially acceptable. And sometimes things are good politically or socially, and they're good um, um, politically, but they're not economical to do. Now let's look at the second type of landmine, authorization to enforcement. No matter how good your idea is, it has to make it through 4 steps for authorization and enforcement, as shown on the next slide. A clever adversary could derail your whole policy if they just understand the process well enough to stop you at any of these steps. And there may be not much you could do about it. Let's talk about those 4 steps. The first one's authorization. That's simply saying we pass a bill. We agree that a bill passes that X, Y, and Z will happen. The second one is that law has to be appropriated. The Congressional Budget Office or Congressional Budget process has to allocate money to it, or state agencies or something, because passing a law is not enough. You have to be able to fund it to be able to do what it needs to be done. For example, if you pass the law, people couldn't spit on the sidewalk, and you had no budget to stop anybody from doing it, then probably nothing would happen. The third is implementation. And again, if you pass a law, and even if you appropriate money, it has to be implemented. A lot of laws can't be implemented very effectively. And sometimes people can try to make that implementation worse on purpose. So, for example, our implementation of drug enforcement some may argue is not implemented very effectively. And last but not least is enforcement. You have to be able to enforce laws or they're really not much good. Now, this may sound obvious, but there are examples where you can't stop somebody in the authorization process. So for example, suppose somebody has a bill, like in Colorado there was a bill I'll talk about in other places as well, that the citizens of Colorado passed a law that traps that clamp down on animals' legs could not be used anymore. You know, these types of traps that are used by old-fashioned trapping lines that have a metal clamp and it chomps on an animal's leg. The people that wanted to still trap, or farmers that needed to trap predators and things like that, they didn't want that to pass, but they knew there was no way they could fight the tide in terms of getting people in Colorado to fight against that. All you had to do was show some pathetic animal in some terrible situation where those laps had maimed them, and many people would vote against it. And that's exactly what happened. The citizens of Colorado voted not to do anything, or not to allow that anymore. Now, then you can, if you know that's going to happen, you can then come along and say, well, I won't try to stop it there, but I'll try to stop it with appropriation. Maybe I will make sure that it doesn't get any dollars appropriated to it, so there's really not any way anybody can stop somebody from doing it. or you may stop it in implementation. You may, for example, in Colorado, the legislature, after this passed, put in a clause that there was a clause in there already that said that there was a 30-day exemption. So people who had a problem with animals, for example, coyotes eating their lambs, could have 30 days to trap. Well, when this was implemented, the government decided to interpret that as 30 days per child. So what happened was that law became basically implemented in a way that was more friendly to trappers. And of course, enforcement is the last one. These government agencies often don't enforce things. And in this case, there were some trappers that actually wanted to have this go to the Supreme Court. And they kept trapping, hoping to get caught because they wanted to be arrested so they could go to the Supreme Court. The wildlife agents in that county wouldn't arrest them. And if you think about it, they probably go to church together or have kids in school together or grew up together or meet at the local bar together. It'd be pretty hard to arrest somebody that's your friend. So a lot of these wildlife agents were reluctant to really enforce things. They turned a blind eye. Or maybe they believed trapping was good. So what happened was these guys tried to get people to arrest them and they wouldn't do it. Now, if you remember back to government failure, this is an example of employee sovereignty. It's a government failure. So in that case, maybe nobody enforced it. So basically, if you understand the process well enough, sometimes the best thing to do is go into one of these four and make sure you get your way. So just by way of using an example, in this case, the law passed. The farm groups might say, well, we'll interpret the 30 days per child. So if you have 3 children and a wife and a husband, that's 5 times 30, that's 150 days. It really becomes a law that passed. Everybody thinks they don't use leg traps anymore, but realistically, you could still do what you always did. Now, another example in Colorado is that we passed a law that hog lagoons had to be covered. Okay, that's authorization. We passed a law. It could have died there, but we funded it with a tax on each animal sold, appropriation. So every time you sell a hog, you have to pay some money into a fund. Now, it sort of died here because the amount of money collected from this fund was not enough to run the program. So nobody wanted to run the program. None of the government agencies wanted it. So it could not be implemented. Finally, the governor said, pick an agency, you will run it. Well, if the agency can't run it for the money they give them, then what happened was they understaffed it. So what happens is they only have somebody, I think it's now 1 day a week working on this program. So they're really probably not going to catch you. So enforcement is very lax. Many shrewd people understand very well that it's easier to derail a program or blow it up with a landmine in the process than when people are trying to pass the bill. So you need to understand that too. The third type of landmine is the participants in the process. You must consider who might be against you and have a plan about how to get them to let you pass or you need a plan to overcome them. So how do you get past a person? Think of it as you're walking through a minefield, literally, and something pops up. You either have to convince that landmine to let you pass, or you have to get around it, blow the landmine up before you are there, forcibly. Okay? There are many participants, and they change over time. The next few slides show some of the participants, but I'm going to move through those really quickly because they're in my notes, and they change so much. I think the main thing I just want you to understand is when you go out there and you think you have a good plan, like suppose you're interested in the youth in agriculture, and you go out and you think, who could be against this? There are lots of people who might be against you and lots of people who might be for you, and it's a good idea to understand who's going to pop up and be in your way before you start trudging through that minefield. So let's quickly go through these participants. One thing I want to point out is one of the policy writers did a clever thing where they sorry, let me get my pointer here to a pen, where they took what we learned in high school, which is there's three branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And they say, well, let's just add a fourth branch. That's interest groups. So you can see here there's producers, consumers, agribusinesses, co-ops, environmentalists, public officials. There's all these different people interested. If you think of the government this way, you kind of get an idea that participants really do matter. So this landmine is not trivial. Again, I'm going to go through this really quickly. So if we start with the House, or the House committees and Senate committees, the legislature, the legislative branch has a House of Representatives and a Senate. Let's not talk too much more about that. The executive branch appoints cabinets. That's what the U.S. Department of Ag, or the Food and Drug Administration, or the Environmental Protection Agency are. The president gets to pick the heads of those agencies when he or she comes into office. Okay, agencies that affect us the most would be USDA, for example, Department of Agriculture. And there's several agencies inside that, like the Farm and Foreign Ag Service, the Farm Service Agency, the Foreign Ag Service, the Risk Management Agency. There are food safety agencies like Food Safety Inspection Service. There are natural resource agencies like Forest Service, the Natural Resource Conservation Service. There are rural development agencies like Rural Business, Office of Community, Housing and Service, and Utilities Service. There are food, nutrition, and consumer agencies, and so forth. So again, I'm not going to go through these because they are in my notes. Okay? The next branch is the interest groups, which I do want to really quickly mention. So there are many, many kinds. So you know, there are general farm organizations like, you know, things like the American Farm Bureau, National Farmers Union, National Grains, American Ag Movement, and so forth. There are commodity organizations like wheat growers, soybean growers, corn growers, cotton council. And these groups are very powerful, very large, and many of them have a lot of influence. Moving on, there are cooperatives. Then there are agribusiness lobbies. There are general lobbies like Grocery Manufacturers, Food Marketing Institute, or Frozen Food Institute. There are commodity agribusiness organizations like Grain and Feed Association, Feed Manufacturers, and so forth. Okay, now that's an example of the participants that might jump up and get in your way. So let's review again. The three minds as we're walking through the minefield is a participant might jump up, like an anti-tax person, or a person that believes there's too many people in America, or a person that believes that corn subsidies create obesity. So a participant can jump up, or we can run into the problem where we have economic and social feasibility but not political feasibility, or the bill can pass but not be implemented or not be enforced. Those are the three landmines we really have to watch out for. So we just talked about those landmines. Let's now talk about how you get through them. Now think about if you were really at a landmine field, you would stand at the edge and say, I got to figure out how to get through here. And you, of course, would probably hire or use some sort of electronic technology that detects the mines and remove the mines or walk around them. So let's give an example of what you might do here. I've come up with three different approaches that you can consider. We can use any or all three at the same time. So think of it again as you're walking through this landmine. Now, I want to use a specific example. I want to use an example of funding for public education. Most people think that's a good thing and are for it, but I want to use an example that you might relate to. Suppose you're single or even married and you don't believe in having kids. You believe the world's too crowded or whatever reason you don't want to have kids. You might resent that you have to pay for schools. So let's just say I'm walking through this minefield. That would make you a participant. And the first thing that happens is I have my bill, it's all ready, I want to fund education. As I start walking through, you pop up, okay? And I say, whoa, well, I'm sorry, what's your problem? And you say, I don't think it's fair that I have to pay for children. So my first argument to you would be ethnocentric. Now, this is about equity, and I like to say the words, do it for them, okay? So the first thing you do is, when it's an altruistic ideal, you say, hey, do it for them. Do it for the children. So you would say, I don't care if you have a kid. You should care about kids. Will you fund this just because you care about kids? Now, not everybody will agree with the altruistic idea, so you might have to use another argument. So suppose this person says, I don't care, I don't really think it's right to have kids, so I don't really care about funding kids. I think that would be bad. So the next thing you do is you say, well, if you don't care about kids, you certainly care about yourself, so instead of doing it for them, do it for you. Now this is about efficiency. You would argue that every dollar they spend on education is returns more than a dollar. So you might say something like, listen, even though you don't have kids, if you help pay to educate kids, you will pay less in taxes because there will be less crime, there will be more educated society, more inventions, and so forth. So you will have enough benefits to make it worth your while. Now this is called a social contract. That is, the government takes away one of your dollars and offers to return something worth more than a dollar. Social contract. All about efficiency. So again, the first one is do it for them, do it for the children. The second one is do it for yourself. Okay. Now the third one is, if that doesn't work, you go to public choice or political economy. This isn't about equity or efficiency, it's about rent seeking. In this case, you would just say, you know, tough luck, get out of my way, and you would just push them out of your way, metaphorically. In this case, it's doing it for me. So instead of saying doing it for them, doing it for the children, or doing it for you, okay, it's do it for me because I want it. When somebody wants something, we call that rent seeking, and they go to the government and try to get the government to pass a law for your own selfish needs, that's called rent seeking. It's not good for equity or efficiency because you're trying to take what's good for you without concern about anybody else. Now, of course, just for example, when I say you just push them out of the way, you might do something like accuse them of stealing or improper campaign financing, and that might get them out of your way. Let's skip through these kind of quick because I just explained these verbally. Again, this is the example I just went through, so let's skip through that. Actually, let me make this point. So I run into that person, and again, the first option is do it for the children, as you see in red. The second option is do it for yourself. And the third one is do it for myself, do it for me. Okay? In my notes, I describe each of these methods in detail and go through a long example of how I might use these approaches to support agriculture. I leave this part for you to read on your own. Now, the altruistic approach is based on the idea that, let's talk a little bit more about each of these, I'm sorry. Let's talk about the altruistic approach first. It's based on the idea that a subject of a policy is special and needs the help in the eyes of the ethnocentric group that you might have targeted. So let's just say you target do it for farmers. So your message is do it for them just because they're good guys. So if you're doing that, that might really resonate with one group of people and not with another. That's the ethnocentric part of this definition. The ethnocentric means that you group people or you come up with sayings that appeal to some group of people, whether that be men versus women, old versus young, Hispanic versus a Native American, or whatever the slice is, farmer versus city person, whatever that slice is, you look at that slice and you say, what's going to appeal to them? And then you try that. Now, let me just ask you a question. Do you think you would get very far if you asked people to help just because they're farmers? Well, it turns out you would. As it turns out, people are very supportive of farmers. So if you tried using the altruistic approach, you probably would get somewhere with that approach. Of course, you can still use other things, but so you're trying to get people to do farm supports, for example, you might just say, well, because it helps farmers. And that actually will win over some people. Now, the next one is social contract. Talk a little more about that. That's the one we're going to use the rest of the semester. When we're done with this week, we are doing social contract or benefit cost analysis. Okay? Because that's the way, the most efficient or I guess objective way a government employee can analyze a policy. Looking at who wins, who loses, what are the gains, what are the losses. Social contract is based on a quid pro quo, a favor for a favor. Just like with any other contract, the idea is both parties are better off if this contract is executed. So for example, you would have to argue that ag needs help. So helping ag is a good thing to do because, for their sake, because ag is special. That would be the ethnocentric or altruistic part. And finally, helping ag helps me by keeping my food abundant and safe. If somebody bought into that argument, you would have a social contract argument. Now, the concept of public choice, the third option, way to get through that minefield, and political economy, is that you try to get your way by imposing a collective choice on everybody that disagree with you. So in other words, I want, let's say, to build a bridge across a piece of water, and I'm going to make money at it. I go to the government, and I try to get the government to pass a law to build this bridge that I'm going to benefit from. I don't really care whether people want to use the bridge. I want to make the money from building the bridge. So, for example, you could enforce a dress code at your school as a way of using a collective. In other words, a collective now tells people what they get to wear. Okay, instead of a private choice where they get to choose their own clothes. Okay. You can define public goods as the economic study of non-market decision making, or simply the application of economics to political science. Now, we do more with this later, so at this point, this is all I really want you to understand. I want to leave you with this graph. As you can see here, I've got, let me get my pointer back here. I've got pros and cons. And if you look at the pros of a market, the idea is the market yields unbiased solutions as long as all parties are free to choose what they want. So for example, if I chose to want to be a basketball player and I'm only 5'6", the market lets me try. And some people actually make it, but most wouldn't. If the government chose what you got to do, it probably would say, you're not tall, you don't get to try that. So the market really is efficient because people get to try what they want. And as long as people have free choice, people aren't going to choose me for that basketball, then it's efficient. Okay? When I say unbiased, that's what I mean. It has no reason to pick black over white, tall over short, or anything like that, except efficiency. Okay? It's blind to those other things. Now, of course, the con is the market really doesn't work that way very often, and those are market failures. We've already discussed market failures. So on the plus side, you let things work out the way they're meant to be, but on the minus side, sometimes that's not very fair. So if we look at the collective choice, there are three main benefits. The first is pooling, and that's the idea that we can tackle big problems if we pool resources. For example, the market could not have developed an interstate system. An interstate highway system is too big. I don't know about you, but I like it when I go in to buy aspirin that we pooled our resources together, created a government agency that tells me whether that aspirin is safe and effective. I would hate to figure that out on my own. So pooling all of us together can sometimes tackle bigger problems than anybody could tackle on their own. A second is information. Sometimes the government has more information than the rest of us. This could be to protect privacy, for example, or because they have pooling. So, in other words, because the government has pooling, they have all these records, they might be able to do something we couldn't do. The third one is neutrality. Now, I said here the market wasn't biased, but sometimes certain kinds of people, like for example with certain kinds of handicaps, aren't going to be able to succeed. Or short people won't be able to be in the NBA, the National Basketball Association. That's a different kind of thing. Because it's unbiased, sometimes those results are not acceptable. We probably, for example, would accept if somebody that's only 5'6" can't get in the NBA, we probably would think that's okay. That's not really a bias. But what if we said people who have handicaps, who can't walk, for example, have a hard time even making a living? Well, in that case, we have to step in. And when we step in, we expect the government to be neutral. In other words, the government should never take one person's side over another because they like them better. If I walk in there and I'm a white male, I should expect the same treatment if I walk in and I'm a black female. Okay? The government should not show favoritism. So sometimes we want the government to handle a problem because we're worried about favoritism and we want neutrality. A good example of that is a police force. In some cases, the private sector can afford their own police force. I think we would probably worry if the private sector ran the police, they wouldn't be neutral. They might do profiling or be unfair in some way. Now, of course, we have the same problem here, is if we leave the government to its own devices, it will lead to government failure. So we end up with a problem where we have either market failure or government failure, but there's no way to have, all the good of one and none of the bad of one. You have to have some of the good and some of the bad. So that comes back to the same place we were before, which is the government failure must be outweighed by the market failure for the government to intervene. But in this case, we're just looking at this a little differently by asking the question, because we're in the process part now, we're asking the question, what about the process part of when we prefer the government to intervene or not intervene? In the process part, the process is we like the market to run if it can, but there are some cases where the government has some advantages. Okay, that ends this section, and I hope you got something out of it, and our next section will be part 6. Bye-bye.